Okay, so we wanted to start a new series where we look at the various candidates for the upcoming candidate cycle and talk about their biography, talk about their personality, talk about their chances against current world champion Magnus Carlsen, and kind of follow along with this as we get more candidates and draw closer to the tournament itself so that we see who is going to be the contender for the World Chess Championship to be contested in October or November of 2016. Tonight we're going to talk about Viswanathan Anand. And if it's your first time here, it's presented by myself, Lucas Anderson. I do the biography portion. Warren does the chess analysis, and thereby we both play to our strengths. So the candidates tournament is going to be held March 9th through 28th, 2016. The venue is unknown, and if anybody knows where the tournament's going to be contested, I'd be interested in knowing. Maybe FIDE hasn't decided yet. I couldn't find it on their website. There are 8 participants in the candidates tournament. It's a double round robin, and the 8 players are determined based on certain qualification criteria. First, you have the runner-up of the World Chess Championship 2014, and that's Anand, who we'll be covering tonight. All other known participants include the winners of the FIDE Grand Prix cycle, and that's Fabiano Caruana and Hikaru Nakamura. We'll be covering them in August and September, respectively. We will also have 2 participants determined based on the results of the Chess World Cup to be contested in September. The top 2 finishers in that tournament will automatically be seeded, and if one of the top 2 is, say, Caruana or Nakamura, then we'll get the number 2 and number 3, for example. So we will get 2 players from that tournament. We will also get 2 players who get in based on rating. So we take the FIDE rating for the players for every month for the year of 2015, and we'll average it together at the end of the year, and whoever has the highest average rating, the top 2 people who have the highest average rating, who have not qualified in some other method, will get seeded into the candidates tournament. So I have a spreadsheet going right now to track who those people are, and you'll see that 4 of the top 5 players are either the world champion or people competing in the candidate cycle. So currently, if that decision were made today, Topalov and Grishuk would be seeded into the candidates tournament. Topalov, I think it's fair to say that he is looking very strong in terms of participating. His average rating has hovered around the 2,800 mark throughout the entire year, and July was his best month ever. Grishuk seems to be somewhat on a downward trajectory, actually. And if these current ratings were to hold true throughout the remainder of the year, Geary would actually participate in the candidates tournament over Grishuk. So, and because of the World Chess Cup and because of the organizers, wild card, and all of that, there's really no telling who's going to get in on rating, but it will certainly be one of the people on this list and probably 2 of the people in this list. And there are a number of players who are below this in the 2750s range, but their chances are quite low unless a number of these people win World Cups and start playing really poorly, etc. So let's focus on tonight's candidate. Viswanathan Anand was born in 1969. He's 45 years old. That makes him the oldest of the players who are going to compete in the candidate cycle. And he's also the most experienced, both in terms of candidate cycles. He's played in his first candidate cycle in 1991. And he has won the World Championship a number of times, and he was the world champion for many years. So he's certainly the favorite in the candidate cycle at the age of 45, which is surprising. We're going to get into that. He is nicknamed the Tiger of Madras. Madras is the old name for Chennai, the city in India where Anand is from. A couple of interesting points to make. Viswanathan Anand's father is named Viswanathan Iyer, I-Y-E-R in English. And it's common, it's culturally acceptable in this part of India to pass on your father's name to the son. So Viswanathan Iyer gave his name Viswanathan to his son, and he became Viswanathan Anand. Anand, by the way, is Sanskrit for happiness. Anand has done the same thing. He's passed on Anand to his own son, and as we'll see, his son is named Anand Akhil. Now, we in the West would look at his name and go, well, let's call him Viswanathan, or let's call him Vishy for short. but his family and pretty much everybody who knows him calls him Anand. So I'm going to call him Anand tonight. And it may seem a little strange for Western ears to hear me refer to him by his last name without an honorific like Mr. or something, but I can assure you that that's perfectly acceptable. I would also tell you that this Tiger of Madras, he doesn't really like that nickname. We use it a lot. It's pretty widely reported. And Anand said, quote, "The thing with the tiger was an invention by some journalist who probably could not think of any other Indian animal. Normally I avoid conflict, and I am indeed not a killer like Kasparov." Anand, as we'll see, is a pretty easygoing guy, and he gets along well with most everyone. Anand was born in a state in India called Tamil Nadu. He moved at an early age to Chennai, which is formerly known as Madras, which is the biggest city in Tamil Nadu. And the official language of this state is Tamil, not Hindi or one of the other 20-some-odd languages commonly spoken in India, which is why on the previous slide I gave his name in traditional Tamil. Of course, he learned English growing up, and I'm sure he learned many other languages as well. So I've talked a little bit about his father. His father was a railway manager, not an engineer. He was a manager for a fairly prominent railway in India. His mother was a stay-at-home mom. We'll get into his relationship with his parents shortly, but suffice to say at this point that he's very close to his family. Anand learned to play chess at the age of 6. He learned from his mother, Sushila, who's pictured here. And I should take this moment to point out that his mother passed away in the month of May, about 2 months ago. So I'm sure that's still fresh in his mind, and our thoughts certainly go out to him. His father is still living, and Anand is very close with his parents and with his family, his uncles, his siblings, etc. And he stayed in Chennai in pretty much his whole life, and so I'm sure that that loss has hit him fairly hard. So he learned to play at age 6, and from his mother. Now that's actually something of a novelty. Most of the players we've studied have learned chess from a parent, but almost all of them have learned from a father. So I thought it was interesting to see that he learned from his mother. Growing up in Chennai, Anand would go to a chess club in Chennai called the Mikhail Tal Chess Club. So they had a chess club named after Tal. The chess club was so busy and because seating was so limited, that they wanted everybody there to play blitz. That way there would be more turnarounds, they could get more games in, and that way it'd be more fair instead of having a table taken up by people playing for hours. So Anand played a lot of blitz, and in fact, one of his early nicknames was the Lightning Kid, because he would play a standard time control match in 10 or 15 minutes. He would just blitz out his moves. Daniel King talks about being unnerved by how fast he was and how accurately he played based on pretty much intuition. Geller, the famous Soviet GM, lost to him in a tournament in Asia in 1988 and went back to Moscow, and his contemporaries kind of made fun of him and said, "We hear you lost to this young little boy who was like 17, 18-year-old at the time." And Geller said, I think I lost to a world champion. So there were signs of greatness from a very early age. In the previous series, I used to go in depth on their rise and that sort of thing. Today, we're going to favor more the chess. So I'm going to go through his childhood a little quickly here. But suffice it to say that Anand earned the International Master title at the age of 15. He was the champion of India at age 16, and he would go on to win that championship many other times, as you might imagine. He was World Junior Champion at age 17, and that's the picture on the bottom right. And he was a Grandmaster at age 18. He was actually the first Grandmaster in history from the country of India, where we think chess originated, essentially almost 2,000 years ago. So that's notable. We talked about Sultan Khan a little over a month ago, and he was certainly a very strong player from India, but he was active before FIDE existed, and so he was never awarded the Grandmaster title, even though he very well may have played at Grandmaster strength. But Anand was the first to receive that official title from FIDE. He knew and played against a lot of the greats. If you look at this picture in the bottom left, seated you see Tal, You see Joel Lautier, who we're going to talk about tonight. And standing, you see Bent Larsen, Victor Korchnoi, Garry Kasparov, Bessel Koch, who is a famous financier for chess, not necessarily a player. See Jan Timman, and you see Boris Spassky. Anand was surrounded by the greats of his era and of our era because he is still an active player, and he's obviously a great in our era also. He listed among his heroes Tal and Fischer. You may look at Anand's style and think more of, Karpov or something, but he listed Tal and Fischer as his chess heroes, and he's met them both. He played against Mikhail Tal, and he beat him with a piece sack, actually, in their first over-the-board encounter. And Fischer he met in 2006. They took a walk and chatted together, and Anand talks about how important that was for him and how Fischer just seemed like a normal guy who was maybe a little paranoid, but he certainly enjoyed that experience. Anand, incidentally, never really has a mean thing to say about anybody. There are certain chess players who thrive on vilifying their opponent. Kasparov springs to mind. Nakamura springs to mind. But Anand is a very level-headed guy, very calm, apparently except when he loses at cards. And he's well-liked in the chess community, so it just speaks to his temperament. So he grew up and played really strong chess, and everybody saw him as a potential prodigy. He graduated high school, went to college in Chennai, graduated with a degree in finance/economics, or commerce/economics, excuse me. He decided he was going to be a professional chess player. His parents supported that decision. He has two older siblings, both a lot older. I think he has a brother who's something like 12 or 15 years older who went into business, and then a sister who, again, is like 10 or 12 years older, who was actually a professor, I think, at the University of Michigan. So very successful family, and he decides to play chess, and his family supported him through that. There's a funny story that Anand talks about where he was on a train traveling somewhere, and somebody asked him, what do you do? And he says, well, I'm a professional chess player. And they start chastising him, say, oh, well, you can't really make a living playing professional chess unless you're like Viswanathan Anand. And of course, that was him. Anyway, he certainly did make a living out of it. Although, if you look, he lives in a very modest house in Chennai and lives simply. He's a pretty down-to-earth guy by all accounts. So he started playing some really tough competition in the late 80s, early 90s, and he actually participated in his first candidate cycle in 1991. And in the second round, he was paired against none other than Anatoly Karpov. Karpov is, if not the strongest player in the world, the second strongest player in the world after Kasparov at this time. And originally, Anand was a little annoyed that he was paired against Karpov, but later he told himself, you know what, if I don't play the best someday, then I'm never going to be the best myself. So in hindsight, he appreciated this game. So in this game, Anand is white, Karpov is black. Black has just played Queen F7, and it's Anand to move. And I want to tell you that he did not play the strongest move here. But take a look at this position, think for 30 seconds, and see if you can figure out what White's best move is.
Queen D8?
Queen D8 is the strongest move. In fact, it's a winning move. Anand played Rook F8, which was annotated with a question mark because it allows Karpov to continue and earn a draw. But Queen D8 was actually winning. So let's see if Warren can do the correct continuation. Queen D8, Rook takes F4.
G4.
G4 is correct. G4 and White wins. So Anand missed this at the board. And of course he was disappointed by missing this because it allowed Karpov a draw. Queen D8 would have threatened Queen H4 mate and protected the Rook. And it would have forced Black to play Rook F4, then G4, and then Black's best case scenario is to be down a rook for a pawn, essentially. So he missed this move, and this stuck with him because he thought that Rook F8 should be good enough. But against the world's best players and such tenacious defenders, it was not. Rook f8 was not. It allowed Karpov to continue and scrap out a draw. And this was a learning experience for Anand. I don't want to say this wasn't a loss. He drew one of the best players in the world. You'd think you'd be happy with that. But it was a win that got away. And in some ways, that gnaws at you just as much. And there are going to be a lot of instances tonight where we're going to see Anand have wins and matches slip through his fingers, and he has to recover from it. He has to bounce back. And that's going to be a recurring theme tonight. So it's why I introduced it so early. You may recall that in 1992, the chess world was thrown in a bit of upheaval because the chess world was split between the PCA and FIDE. Garry Kasparov, I talked about in my Kasparov lecture, and Nigel Short decided to form their own organization called the Players Championship Association, I believe, PCA. And they were going to hold their own championship. And FIDE essentially disqualified them from their world championship cycle and set up Karpov and Timman, who Short had defeated essentially, in a different match to determine the FIDE champion. And so for many, many years, from 1992 through I think 2005, 2006, the chess world was split between those two championships. And Anand, who's completely apolitical, participates in both cycles, like a lot of players did. And he lost in the FIDE cycle to Gadakomsky, but he beat Gadakomsky in the PCA cycle to earn the right to play Garry Kasparov for the 1995 championship. You may have seen this picture of them playing in the World Trade Center. This match was a clear win by Garry Kasparov. However, the first 8 matches were drawn, and many saw this as a sort of victory for Anand because they assumed that it meant that he had neutralized Kasparov's notoriously good opening prep. And in fact, Anand drew first blood in the match by winning game number 9 of their match. And for the first game of that we're going to cover tonight, we're actually going to cover 5. We're going to look at that game number 9. And we're also going to look at Anand versus Lautier, who was a frequent competitor of Anand because they're close to the same age. This one was played in Biel in 1997. And as always, for the analysis of those games, I'll turn it over to Warren.
So one thing I'll just get off my chest at the start of the series, I'm by no means a gambling man, but if you force me to put money on who would win the candidate cycle, I would say it's Anand. Yeah, and we'll kind of go through some of the reasons later. But first, let's look at this game against Kasparov. Okay. So, this game was important for Anand. He had not beaten Kasparov in a classical game since, I think it was 1991 or 1992. He had a long drought. I mean, that's a long time to go without beating, one of your peers like that. Well, I mean, to give him credit, he is Kasparov, so it's not exactly an easy task. But he talks about how optimistic he was immediately following the game anyway. We'll see. You might have noticed in the match record that he actually lost the very next day. But we'll get into that in a minute. So the game started off with a Scheveningen, which they had played several games already, I believe. And it was an opening that both sides had kind of expected and prepared for the match. So this is all pretty much standard. It's occurred in thousands of Grandmaster games. Rook e8. This is kind of a key move for the whole line. The idea being that it's very useful to have this rook eyeing this bishop on e3 and on the e-file. It may not look like the e-file would become open, but if white ever wants to play f5, rook e8 discourages that. So rook e8, bishop f3, another very popular move. And here is kind of the branching point. So Kasparov chose bishop d7. For most of his career, he actually played this rook b8 move, which theory kind of prefers now. Black has a bunch of options, by the way. He can play bishop f8, knight a5, rook b8, bishop d7 like he did. So there is a lot of flexibility here. One of the things I like about rook b8 is that it leaves the option of deploying this bishop on a more active diagonal, and it also leaves a d7 square available for the knight, which is a useful maneuver in this position. Because one of white's primary plans here is, for example, a move like g4, trying to attack on the king side. For example, bishop g2, g5, rook f3, rook h3, queen h5, just trying to brute force checkmate black like that. So that's just one idea. So it's useful to have this d7 square to go to when white plays g5. So it's kind of for that reason that personally I prefer rook b8 or knight a5 or bishop f8. Bishop d7 is by no means losing, but it leads to a different kind of game, which we'll see here. So knight retreats. This move is important for white. So, for example, if white had played queen d2, what do you think black would do here? Actually, in case of this move, there's probably an additional option. But e5 would allow white to play either knight b3 or knight f5. Either one looks playable, I think. Oh, rook to d8? No,
you simply just take that.
Yeah, this is one of the simpler ideas, right? So you just take the knight, and it helps to exchange that. And if white takes back, you can play e5 and then play bishop c6. So black will then have activated the bishop, right, without too much difficulty. I mentioned queen d2 gave an additional possibility. You could also consider knight a5 here, intending maybe knight c4 as a thematic idea here as well. So you'll oftentimes see people play knight b3 in these Scheveningen positions, and it's just very thematic to try to prevent the exchange of those knights. So, I mean, the base explanation is that white has more space. When you have more space, you do not want to exchange pieces, generally speaking.
Especially bishops.
I would agree with you, but that's probably a biased point of view, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's preference.
Who wins in this game?
Well, you can take a guess, but we'll see. Yeah.
Oh, we'll see.
The black's knight a5 move is actually really important. Now, black could try a move like maybe rook c8 or rook d8, but in either case, white would have a strong reply. So as a hint, black's last move, knight a5, was to stop an idea of white's. So white to play, what should white do? Which one?
A1.
Yeah, a5. Yeah, this move is really important. Black loses a lot of space because white is going to plant that bishop on b6. And it really cramps black on the queen side. He gives white a4 for the knight, or maybe the rook.
Yeah.
So this is a really important idea too. You almost never want to allow that pawn structure to happen. Also outside of this particular position, that one white pawn, you may notice, would then restrict black's two.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so that's not a favorable pawn structure. So Kasparov plays knight a5 to stop this idea of white. White captures because otherwise this knight's going to hop into c4. So black has managed to exchange pieces, but at some penalty, which we'll see. So queen d3. The penalty is that the queen is basically kind of misplaced on a5. Now, Anand mentions that there are lots of different possibilities here. You could play queen d2 as another choice. I believe he mentioned bishop d4 as another one. Well, I had some options, but I guess he decided on queen d3 as an over-the-board idea. So he had prepared this exact position at home. So rook a d8, rook d1, bishop c6. Now, even though we are really far into the game, it's pretty much both players had seen this position before.
Now, the reason
This is not
that is that because, say, they've seen enough of their games going towards this position that they'll generally favor that position. Therefore, they'll study hard into that position.
Exactly, that's a good point. Yeah,
They
Kasparov
won't have to
was.
study all the other options because they know
Yeah.
they're wrong. So to say, because Kasparov is playing.
Oh yeah, yeah. For
is he
Kasparov,
playing?
he played the Sicilian a huge majority of the time. I mean, I actually don't even know what else against e4 he played. I mean, I feel like all the games I remember him, I mean, he would play the Sicilian. So for Anand, I think it's almost pretty easy. Like, I don't even know if Kasparov ever, for example, even played the French. I can't remember a single game where he did that. He may have, maybe as like an experiment.
Yeah.
Now he did play the Carol-Con a couple times, and I'm sure he played the E5 as well. But Sicilian was his main weapon, so for Anand this was something he knew. This way, Rook D1, Bishop C6, now B4. Now this move is pretty nice. Now why can't Black take it? Black's queen is short of squares. So I'll give you the first move. It's Rook D B1. Queen only has one choice. And now?
Bishop.
Exactly. So the queen can't go to B5, C5, D5, E5, F5, G5, or H5. All those squares are covered. And of course there's nothing free, so the queen is dead. So the B4 pawn is immune. And B4 is important because White's going to gain space and push the Black light squared bishop to passivity again. So B5, Bishop D7, and Rook A B1. This was actually a new move for the position. This position had actually occurred before in a game, which I guess Anand wasn't familiar with, but Kasparov probably was. The other game had featured Knight E2. After which it was okay for Black. I think Black played Rook C8, and Black was okay. So this Knight E2 move was just too passive. So Anand over the board came up with Rook B1, which is a very nice move. The idea is to threaten takes and Bishop B6, and it turned out to be a rather annoying threat for Black actually. So in the game he took on B5. He could have played Rook C8, but in this case, Anand had a nasty reply in mind. I'll give you a hint. It's a thematic break for White in these open Sicilian positions.
Should play like Rook B3? Double the rooks in B5?
Rook B3 is probably reasonable, yeah. But I think it would allow Black to neutralize some of the pressure after, say, Queen C4. So this is a really thematic move for Sicilian positions. E5. E5.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a break that White will really push for a lot of times in these positions. The idea
It also kicks the knight, and you can take that bishop if you really.
Yeah, unfortunately, when White plays E5 in the open Sicilian, usually the Black Knight doesn't have good squares. And the reason is usually to open up the king side because White will oftentimes have a bishop on D3 that gets unleashed. But here it's actually to release the bishop from the other direction. So Black's in trouble. For example, you could take the pawn, but then bishop D4.
You don't even have to take that. Well, yeah.
Well, it's hard for Black to avoid taking it because the knight has no good squares. And taking on C3 is bad because F6 and D7 would hang. So say you take, but now bishop D4, queen C7 takes. And Anand mentions that it's a great endgame for White because White's going to take on B7 and D7 and get a passed A pawn. You know, for example, you could take, but then queen D7, say take on C3, and now White could probably play a couple different options. Maybe bishop takes B7, and White's going to have a passed A pawn here. And this is it's going to be difficult for Black to stop it since this bishop controls the queening square. So this would not have been a good situation for Black. So this is why Kasparov decided to take on B5, but the disadvantage of this is now White's knight gets in on the queen side. So Black took. It is hard to offer a suggestion. Queen A5 isn't really good because of knight takes D6. Attacks the rook, threatens bishop B6. Black is left without really a good reply. But unfortunately, it does give White the two bishops. So of course, you know, this is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a decisive advantage.
He still has that threat. That's why you have to.
Yeah, bishop B6 is still threatened. Whoops. Bishops can't move. Bishops can't move quite like
That would be
that.
a pretty nice move. You could do it. You know?
So rook A8 to put pressure on the A4 pawn. Now C4. Yeah, E5. It's hard to offer advice here. I mean, eventually you're going to have to stop E5, either now or later. And here White plays a really nice move, which Some people have criticized, but I really like it. Well, okay, actually, it's the next move. Rook d5. I really like this move because it puts pressure on e5. The rook is excellently placed on d5 itself in the center. And if black takes the rook, then it gives white a pass pawn.
Yeah.
And it opens up white's high squared bishop even more. So I actually really like this idea. Now, I guess the reason it was criticized is because black doesn't have to take the rook. So I guess the idea was that black could sit tight and force white to show something. But if black does nothing, white will just play rook d1 and c5. And I hardly see a way for black to keep his position under control for long.
You can't take it again.
Oh, he can, and that's what Kasparov did. But the disadvantage for black is that you give white a pass pawn. Yeah. You kind of fix white's pawn structure. And one way of looking at it is in terms of pawn islands. In general, in chess, you want to reduce the number of pawn islands you have. So by playing knight takes d5, white goes from 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands to 3.
So he
right?
sacrifices a rook, so you get that pawn.
The exchange. He's not
Yeah,
sacrificing.
it's just an exchange.
Well, so
Yeah.
like,
So white sacrifices the exchange to reduce the number of pawn islands, so fewer weaknesses, and 2 to get the pass pawn. If you order them in importance, the pass pawn is more important, but the improved pawn structure is not trivial either. So Kasparov decided to chop the rook while he could. And while, to me, the position looks optically easy for white, Kasparov plays some tricky moves, as you'll see.
What would have been the better move, though? Sorry.
Instead of rook d5?
Instead of that, yes. Some people criticize it. What would have been the better move?
Oh, basically...
Yeah.
Yeah, so they thought he shouldn't have sacked at all. They thought he should have just pushed his c-pawn. Put his rook behind it and tried to create a pass a-pawn by trading this for this.
But say he brings the rook up, he doesn't take. How can he pull that off?
Oh, you're right. It's not easy.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is you're going to play moves like you're going to move your queen, and then you're going to get this bishop to b5, and then you're going to push c6 and eventually get that passed a-pawn. So I guess some people thought that would be easier than giving up the exchange.
Yeah.
I prefer a non-solution, and he himself gives rook d5 an excellent.
Just
Yeah, just a matter of style, I guess. And in any case, white's definitely clearly better here. So he took and played queen g6. So this prepares to advance the e-pawn. So black has gained a pass pawn himself. So it is a double-edged reply for white. So rook e5, this is a really nice move. Brings the rook over to maybe attack on the king side. And we of course attack this d-pawn. So queen d7. Yeah, d6 would be a blunder. It's tempting to advance the pass pawn, but it's not a good idea here. Exactly, yeah. This rook created a pin on this 5th rank, so black could just take the pawn. So first, white has to bring the queen down. This move also attacks b7, so black's kind of burned his bridges, so he has to attack on the king side. So rook g1. There's no reason to even calculate allowing black rook takes g2. e3. d6. Pawn gets closer to the promised land. Now rook g3. This is a tricky move. So queen takes b7. Now queen e6.
Oh.
Kasparov is sneaky.
Oh, what an interesting move.
So white has no time to capture the rook or push a pawn or anything because black is threatening rook h3 and checkmate. So pretty scary, and it's not all that obvious how to stop it, because black also has ideas with possible perpetual checks. For example, if rook f1, Kasparov had a really sneaky reply in mind, which Anand only noticed at the last second, I guess he almost decided on rook f1. But black has a really sneaky No, black can play this really tricky move, rook b8.
What?
Yeah, that was.
And if you take, then we have rook
Oh,
h3.
then you do.
And if you take, we have perpetual check. And the wind would have slipped through his fingers. So in this case, there was really no option to play just a standard move. So luckily he thought about it, and Anand came up with a sneaky move himself. So he played king h2. I think it's kind of a cool move. Kasparov actually resigned here, but queen e5, which looks kind of scary setting up discovered checks, white can actually just take the rook. Because black's rook has nowhere to go that would cause white any distress. The rook can't actually take anything. Yeah, so after king h2, Kasparov just gave up the ghost. Anand noted, he mentions about this game that, he mentioned how optimistic he was after winning against Kasparov, and he lost the very next day. And then he says that he thinks that chess-wise he was basically, around Kasparov's level, but he didn't have the nerves that Kasparov did. He said he basically would blunder and thoughts might wander. He couldn't.
So are you saying that Kasparov was intimidating to Anand?
Maybe not necessarily Kasparov intimidating, but Kasparov handled the pressure better. He said he really, the enormity of the match, I guess, kind of overwhelmed Anand.
He was playing in his first world championship.
Yeah,
Kasparov was playing in his sixth or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons that I favor Anand reaching the world championship match again, because of his experience, and he's dealt with these nerves before, so he's more used to the situations. So let's go on to Lautier was the next game, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, is this the game? I think it is. Yes. Yeah, this game is fun. So this was a surprise for Anand. This was Lautier's first time playing this game even against him. So right away, there's no absolute prep for this game. Although he talks about his general knowledge here. So typical Scandinavian, right? Knight c3, gaining a tempo. Queen a5, d4. Now bishop c4 is a tricky move. Modern theory kind of favors knight e5 a bit more. The idea of knight e5 is to perhaps harass the black queen from c4, and also to prevent the development of this light-squared bishop out to g4. But bishop c4 is tricky, as you'll see. So bishop f5, now knight e5, e6, and now white can gain space on the king side with g4. So it's very tricky. Bishop g6. And now there's a key move for white. It's thematic, and both this and if you notice the pawn structure, it's kind of like a Caro-Kann. So white has a thematic idea, which you'll see often in that opening too.
H4.
Exactly, h4. Pursuing the bishop further. So the problem is white's threatening to trap this bishop. So knight d7.
Why doesn't he push the pawn?
So that's a good point. So black could play h6 or h5, but in either case, white will take. And not only is black's pawn structure ruined, but he will lose a pawn and light squares will be weak. So this is almost never acceptable in these kind of positions. So black has to play tactically. So knight d7. The idea is that they're h5. He has bishop e4. Because this knight is pinned, it doesn't actually guard that square. Now here's another key move for white here. So you might be tempted to play a move like f3, but that only forces the bishop to go where it wants to go. So instead, he plays a productive move with rook h3. So this both guards the knight and prepares to get the rook kind of in a non-standard fashion, in the game on the e-file. So bishop g2. Now this is kind of an interesting finesse. The idea is that you want to force the rook to g3, and then when you play bishop d5, you can develop your bishop to d6 with tempo. So this is the idea behind playing bishop g2. It's not just a Lautier hoping that Anand doesn't see his rook is hanging. Okay? There is an idea there. But Anand came up with a nasty novelty. He played rook e3. So he thinks the bishop is misplaced on g2, and he is right. And he's setting up a nasty idea with this. So now knight d6, bishop d3, knight d5, and now f3. So this was his cool idea. So he's trapping the bishop behind enemy lines. So he's not worried about giving up the rook for the knight because he knows he's going to pick up that bishop as well. So this is a very tricky situation for black. So black played bishop d4. it turns out that this kind of leads to an avalanche, as you'll see. But Black could play a very interesting idea according to the computer. You could take the rook. And now Black has a very cool move here, which is thematic for these positions where the knight's pinned by the queen like this. Black has a really neat move. It's worth remembering, too.
Oh, wait, no, what about the bishop? What's wrong with bishop d4? Then he goes the king over, and you take the pawn with that bishop.
Well, this is possible, but white
And
with
then
the
you
two
take
bishops here.
the
Yeah.
queen, then
For
you take that
example-
and you get up the pawn.
For example, rook d1. So materially speaking, Black has a rook and two pawns for two pieces, right?
But they're two of Black's best attacking pieces.
Yes.
Black doesn't have any rooks in the game.
Yeah,
His
it's
only
all
developed
like-
piece right now is the
Yeah.
queen.
So materially speaking, Black is doing well. But if you look at the remaining pieces, Black's two rooks are both passive, and in the near future, it's not clear what their targets are going to be. Whereas White's pieces are fully
But you
developed,
Take that bishop.
and White already has threats. White could deal with like h6 and queen f6. Yeah, it's pretty much a lost position for Black.
Yeah, you're right. All right.
But Black can play a tricky move here. So the move is bishop to a3.
What? Yeah.
It's very sneaky. So this creates a bigger threat than bishop b4. Now king f2 would be met by taking the pawn, and Black will just straight up win a piece now. Okay. So it's very nasty. So White really doesn't have a great way of defending that b2 pawn. You know, if you play queen c1, Black will take on c3, and then take your queen, and then the bishop will escape via f3.
So that's move bishop. Bishop.
Well, it turns out the best way for White is to take the bishop. But Black's idea is not to take the knight on c3, because then king f2 leads to a similar position that we were just debating. Black's idea is instead bishop takes f3.
Okay.
So
Then you can actually win.
the trick is that if you take on f3, Black will take here
Yeah.
and win this rook.
So really.
So unfortunately, White will have to play like queen d2.
And then the bishop escapes.
Right, and now the bishop escapes, and it's a better situation for Black because he gets more pawns. It turns out that Black, oddly enough, the top move to the computer is h6. The idea that you're going to pick up this g4 pawn anyway. So Black will take on g4 next, and you'll have a nice material compensation, and you'll probably pick up h5 as well. But yeah, so anyway, this was Black's best chance. But Lautier did not have the aid of a computer, so he played bishop b4. Now king f2. Takes. But White is incredibly active here. Queen d4. Rook takes b7. Rook d8. Now, of course, Black would like to castle, but here it is not a good idea.
Oh. Bishop takes. Bishop takes. That's right.
Yeah. The queen hangs, right? So unfortunately for Lautier, he can't get that king out of the center yet. So rook d8. And here Anand plays a really nice conception. So h6. Now, that move may look a little strange, but he played it for the following reason. So he was looking at bishop g6 here, trying to checkmate Black. And after queen takes d1, bishop takes f7, king f8, bishop a3. It looks like Black has made it. But he has this stupid move knight e7. So there's no mate yet. Okay. It's very close. So Anand's idea is that putting the pawn on h6 makes life a little bit easier. Okay. So h6 sets up this following mating combination. So Black takes the pawn. But now bishop g6. The difference now is that the bishop will checkmate from h6. So for example, if you take the queen, how does White mate?
Bishop
Rook
takes.
takes. E6 check.
Yes, rook e6, opening up the bishop. King f8, bishop h6, and mate. This was the idea that Lautier missed.
So he lost that one?
Well, he kept playing it. It's worth seeing how Anand wins. But bishop g6 is decisive, yeah. The problem is black's queen is hanging and white's threatening mate. But okay, let's see how Anand finishes. So knight e7, defending the queen and defending f7. Queen takes queen, and rook d3. So white is perfectly happy trading rooks. Now, by the way, black can't avoid a trade because he gets mated. Or, if not mated, he loses a lot of material. Yeah. So he has to trade. But now, black is going to lose that bishop. For example, he could try bishop h1, but then bishop b2, and black is going to be in zugzwang. Can't move the king, knight, or rook, so he basically has no way to defend himself. So after bishop d3, he just resigned. So this game is pretty spectacular. So any more questions about this one? All right. Thank you, Lucas.
I'm glad Warren brought up the point about Anand's nerves and saying that Kasparov was prepared for their match quite well, and that Anand may have lost because he wasn't accustomed to the grueling condition that is a 12 or 15 or 18, 20-some-odd game match. It was a wake-up call for him to get better. So he took his loss in stride. And in fact, he talked about reinventing himself. This is what he said in 1995, which is, I think is really interesting because it's this theme that I'm coming back to over and over again. This idea that Anand bounces back from losses and reinvents himself. He talks about when he lost to Kasparov, he could have then faded into oblivion. There are a number of players who have competed for world championships whose names you don't recall very easily in the past, say, 20 years, because after their shot, their subsequent results didn't live up to that standard, and we don't talk about them much anymore. There are even FIDE champions from the early 2000s, for example, that we may not be able to name from memory. Anand was determined that would not happen to him, so he set about to improve, and he set about to get other aspects of his life in order. And it's interestingly enough, it's at this time in late 1995 that Anand gets married, or he meets his future wife, I should say. So her name is Aruna, and as is the case in many Indian families, it was an arranged marriage. Both potential husband and wife had the option to veto if they so chose. But their families set up this meeting, and they met, and as Aruna says, as we had nothing outwardly annoying to say about each other, we decided to be married. That was 20 years ago, and they're happily married to this day. Now, again, this is to Western thought, and we have this idea of what marriage and courtship and all this should be. In many families in India, it's very different. But I have to say that after looking at interviews and reading, Anand's book and this, that, and the other, they seem, as far as I can tell, to be the happiest couple on the planet. They seem to be very well suited for each other. They seem to be very happy and have a great relationship. So more power to them. So they were married. Anand had his ups and downs in the period between 1995 and 1999, some close calls, some matches that he wasn't very happy with, some tournaments he didn't do as well as he could, and other tournaments where he showed that he was still in the top three in the world, up there with Karpov and Kasparov and an emerging Kramnik and some of the other strong players at the time. In 2000, you may remember that FIDE changed. Well, when I say FIDE, I really should say Kursana Yumazov, the president and still president of FIDE, decided that instead of a match, they were going to try a knockout tournament. Thought perhaps that would be more exciting, get some more people involved, get some new blood, blah, 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 blah. So they did a knockout tournament. Anand was seeded number 1 in that tournament. You remember that Kasparov still wasn't playing in FIDE events. And Anand actually won it. It was a long journey to get there. You played 2-game matches all the way up until the quarterfinals, and then you played longer matches throughout the remainder. And he won pretty convincingly over some strong players and then some players that, frankly, we've never heard of. And in the finals, he crushed Shirov. Crushed him 3.5 to a half that's dominating. Drew the first game, then won the remaining 3 to win the World Championship. So in 2000, Viswanathan Anand won his first FIDE World Championship. The PCA still had its own championship, and you may remember this was the year that Kramnik defeated Kasparov to unseat him as the PCA champion. So you might think that this is the best day of his life, and it's certainly a great accomplishment, but Anand was a little bit troubled by his win, because when he won the championship, people would ask him, say, "So you're the world champion?" And he couldn't just answer yes. He couldn't answer with just one word. That's the way he explains it. I couldn't use one word. I had to use like 8 paragraphs to explain that the chess championship was divided and that he was FIDE champion, but Garry Kasparov was PCA champion. And Bobby Fischer was still out there claiming that he had retained his title in 1993 against Boris Spassky. So he was still world champion as well. So there was this idea that if there are 2 world champions, then there are no world champions. So this troubled Viswanathan Anand. In 2002, he lost his title in another knockout tournament. He regained that title, as we will see, after the titles were unified. And we'll get to the latter part of his career. But because in this series we're going to be focusing a lot on the chess, I'm going to cut Warren down to a short break and ask him to show us maybe some people consider this Anand's immoral versus Bologan, and then my personal favorite game of Anand, which is against Aronian, played much more recently. So again, we'll take a look at those 2 games. We'll come back and look at the latter part of his career, and then we will talk about his matchup against Carlsen.
So this Bologan game was another example of just Anand's very well researched opening preparation. It was all right. So the opening was a Carol Khan, and kind of an interesting point to mention in the opening. So I'll talk about it a little bit. So knight d7. So this is an alternative. I mean, bishop f5 is black's main move here, getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain, and the other option is the Bronstein-Larsen with knight f6. Now, knight d7 is kind of a more passive way of playing it, but it was a favorite of Karpov and some others, and it's very solid in its own right. So let's see, knight g5. So this is a very energetic move for white. The idea is that this knight cannot be easily kicked out. For example, h6, white would have a strong reply here. White is not forcefully winning, but about +1. Say, what's that?
I think a knight takes e6.
There's nothing on e6.
No, I said knight takes. I meant knight goes to e6.
You're right. So the knight is immune because checkmate.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sort of checkmate.
Right. So black has to play a move like queen a5, and bishop d2, and white's going to take this bishop on f8.
And then you can't castle.
Well, black might take back with a knight,
Yeah.
but it's a very poor position for black. The knights are not well placed on f8 and g8, and black is down a bishop, right? So as far as I'm concerned, that's decisive. So h6 is not possible. So knight f6 first. Black is content to just continue with development. Now bishop c3. Now e6. Knight f3. And here's kind of an interesting point. So you may think, well, we can now play h6, right? Because now knight e6, there's no checkmate. And this was actually the choice of Kasparov in game 6 of his 97 match with Deep Blue. And if you know anything about history of that match, that did not end well for Kasparov. In fact, interesting story behind that. There's actually a mural painted in at the back of a basketball court. So so where I work, there's like a gym and a basketball court, and they hired someone to paint a giant mural on the wall which is the 18th move of that game. It shows the position. It's kind of interesting where Kasparov was on. Yeah, it turns out he lost pretty quickly. And that match was that game was definitely I'd almost say a big turning point for history of chess. But anyway, that's just part of the history. So it was pretty well known at that point that h6 was not a good idea. So bishop d6, queen e2, h6 now, knight e4. So queen g4, a very annoying move, pressuring this g7 pawn. Now, probably the most circumspect idea is king f8. It may look really passive, but the king actually turned out to be kind of safe enough on f8, and black will complete development with bishop b7 and c5. But at the time, there was this popular move with g5, which people were playing. And even Anand himself had actually played this move the year before. And there's someone copied and pasted a transcript on chessgames.com about an interview he had, and so I'll just go forward a move here. So Anand was on the black side of this exact same position a year ago. I forget his opponent. I think it was Ponomaryov. He was playing a match with him, and Ponomaryov chose knight d2, which is probably okay, but it's not very energetic. Right. Anand came up with a clever solution. But apparently during that game with Ponomaryov, he was kind of terrified of an improvement he saw for white, which he later employed in this game. And that improvement is rook e1. Very, very nasty move. The idea is to sack on e6. So, for example, he played bishop f8. Now g4 would be a very risky idea. Queen takes h6, take the knight, and white's idea is rook e6. It's really kind of nasty. I mean, if black doesn't accept the sacrifice, he leads to bad things. If you accept the sacrifice, you could argue that, yeah. Now, if you accept the sacrifice, it also leads to very, very bad things, right? For example, rook g7. I don't know, maybe bishop c4. That looks nice. Maybe rook e1. That also looks nice. Maybe queen g6. That looks nice too. Yeah, there's a lot of moves that look good for white there. So Bologan obviously was not too thrilled with that idea, so he played bishop f8 to stop that queen takes h6 possibility. So now g4 is a very real threat. Queen f5. So white does not want to be forked, so just moves a queen. Kind of simple when you think about it. And g4 now wouldn't be a good idea too, because white can get this bishop in the game. So bishop g7. It is interesting to note here, in Anand notes too, black actually has a highly unintuitive move that would give him maybe a reasonable game. Black can play this move rook g7. Not exactly a move a human would think of, but the idea is you want to put an end to these sacrifices on e6, because now you could just block on e7 with the rook.
Yeah.
So black can now play bishop b7 and think about castling. In which case, maybe his position is not so bad.
Yeah.
So this would have been the best possibility. I just mentioned this because pretty much this game pretty much killed the variation with g5. People didn't want to be framed on the wall like Bologan was, so people nowadays play king f8. But anyway, I'll just want to mention, rook g7, it's playable for black. But okay, bishop g7, h4. H4 is just a very thematic move in this kind of position. Whenever your opponent has extended pawns like that, it's natural to try to break them apart and create a weakness. So h4, king f8. So now the white queen's under threat. Queen h3. Rook h8. So white can't win the pawn because of discovery. But nonetheless, white does find a nice square for the queen again. And g5 is still under attack. c5. Trying to open up this bishop and get the rook into the game. bishop takes g5. Anand does note that queen takes g5 is probably even better, with the idea of bishop f4 and queen g3 and then bishop d6. So he notes this is probably even better, but bishop takes g5 is plenty, as you'll see. So cd4, rook d1. So bringing our last piece into the game, right? You might be tempted to start sacrificing, but you want to first get all your pieces in the game, right? So bishop d7. And now the fun begins. Rook e6. So white will start stripping these pawns from the black king one by one. So of course, if white doesn't take the rook, then white simply won a pawn. And otherwise, white has nasty ideas with bishop e7. So f takes e. And now how does white continue the attack?
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, so distraction. So white wants to lure the black king out of the nest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So bishop e7, there's not really much choice. You got to take it. King g8 would be embarrassingly mated, right? So it takes. Queen g7. King doesn't have much where to go because if you go back, then you lose the rook. So unfortunately, there's nowhere to go but up. Now knight takes d4. May look like a quiet move, but we're threatening knight b5. Queen c5. And now white would like to unleash the rook on the king. So bishop f5. So this attacks e6, puts pressure on that, threatens to move the knight with discovery. I mean, basically the threat of knight e6 is just crushing. So black chose queen e5. Oh wait, already it's kind of hard to offer much suggestion. But okay, queen e5, knight f3. Yeah, the problem is he loses the queen, but it is hard to offer a suggestion. I mean, if you play like bishop d5, what would white do? Yeah, bishop e6 might be good, but yeah, knight takes e6 to me looks pretty nasty. And you have ideas like queen c. Oh, queen c2 is not possible. Okay, this is worse than I thought. Yeah, I mean, say queen c6. You could play maybe knight f4. Not good. Yeah, knight f4. Yeah, now white's threatening things like rook d5 followed by queen d7.
Go.
Yeah, for example, rook g8, check, check. Right. This is not good. Yeah, other than giving back the queen, I don't see much way to defend against white's threats. So knight f3, queen back, and we take the queen. And unfortunately, black is too poorly coordinated to have... Black does have two rooks for the queen, but unfortunately his pieces are a little bit uncoordinated and the king is weak. So Anand exploits this. Yeah, and here he resigned. The threat of bishop b5 is pretty strong. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a good way to beat it.
I think white's up a good 6 or 7 points here.
Oh yeah. I think the Stockfish says like +6. For example, bishop c6. Anand knows just knight f8. It's pretty crushing. So going back to the final position. Yeah. So in that interview I mentioned from chessgames.com that someone posted, the question posed to Anand was, do you think you've ever played a perfect game of chess? And he says, well, if I had to pick one, I probably didn't make any bad moves in my game with Bologan. And I have to agree with him. This is pretty much close to a perfect game. Yeah. Any questions about this? I do find it interesting that he basically won off a prep that he did in his head in a previous over-the-board game on the other side.
Yeah, that is pretty fun.
And also Aronian game. This one's cool. This game, again, shows the depth of his preparation, which he's just excellent at. So, let's take a look. So the opening we have is a Moran. So d takes c4. This is the idea of the Moran. Now, the idea of the Moran by taking on c4 is to solve the problem of the slice squared bishop. Because in these positions, the slice squared bishop is very passive, hard to find an active role for. So black's idea is to play b5 and fianchetto it on b7. So it's a typical idea for these lines. Now bishop d6. Now moves like a6 and bishop b7 are more popular, but bishop d6 has its merits too. The idea being to counter e4 with a move like e5. So that's the idea of bishop d6. A little bit of a sideline, but it's definitely well known to Aronian. c2, hitting h7, a3. a3 may look mysterious, but white's idea is to try to play b4 to stop black from unleashing the vice bishop. But black does have a nice move to kind of force it through anyway. So he played rook c8. So this move has been kind of gaining traction lately. This was also played by Sevian against So back in April in the U.S. Championship, and Sevian actually beat So in a nice game. I'll mention that again later. So this line seems like a pretty healthy one for black. So Aronian played this move knight g5. I will mention, so there's an interview Anand does for this game, and the interviewer asks him, where did Aronian go wrong? It's not that clear when you look at the game that white made any bad moves. But he does mention that white has a move in the next move, and probably also rook d1 is probably also an improvement. Again, to try to discourage c5. Right? But anyway, knight g5. And knight g5 is a thematic move for this position. So it's definitely not, not a ridiculous move. So one of the ideas is that you may notice black can actually win a pawn here. Yeah, black can actually just take h2, and then play knight g4, and take the knight. But this gives white really nice compensation, because this vice-squared bishop is going to be hemmed in, and all what black has gained is an h-pawn, which, as we'll see in the game, isn't that important for white either. And Anand notes that this line is worse than the line where black plays a6 with rook on a8, because, for example, after white plays b4 in these positions, black will have to play a6 in order to try to force through c5 anyway. So this line would be a worse version than the normal lines. But Anand instead plays c5, which, again, this is all preparation that he's done. And so Aronian took on h7, and he knows that this is probably just good for black, or at least that's his opinion. In a later game, the game I mentioned earlier was So and Sevian. So took on h7, and that led to some complications after king h8, and let's see, I think what did white do? White played f4, and g6. That game went like this. It's a very complicated game, but it's actually occurred in a couple games. There was that So game, and then there was later a game by Laurent Fressinet, another strong French player, and he also won on the black side. So,
Question.
Sure.
Let's moves back
Sure thing.
knight to g5. Alright, so after knight to g5, couldn't black just simply do, let's say, g6 to cut off the bishop and queen?
So g6 is
Because that's what I commonly see when I'm competing.
yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. So white's idea after g6. So part of the conception of knight g5 is to let white play this move f4. And the problem for black is that he's going to be in a bind. So, for example, you cannot play c5 yet. So maybe a6, right? But then white will play b4. And white has this bind on the dark squares that, yeah. And it's not easy for black to break out of that. So this is the kind of position black wants to avoid. Yeah. Yeah, one thing to keep in mind in the Moran variation for black is that if you let white achieve this kind of structure, generally speaking, it's not going to be good. So this is part of the idea of knight g5, is to attack h7, act like you're trying to win the pawn. By the way, the other idea is, you mentioned g6. The other obvious move is h6. Right? Knight g5, go away. But white's idea is to play knight e4. and he's going to try to clamp down on c5. So, for example, if you take, knight takes, say, move the bishop, play like b4, and then black's high-squared bishop will remain passive.
He has no bishop control anyway.
You couldn't black have done h6 before the knight even made it to g5?
Well, you could, but it would be a little bit of a waste of time. So, for example, here h6 doesn't really help you accomplish your goals, right? White could continue maybe with b4 anyway.
Knight on g5 would be pretty annoying.
It does seem annoying, but you'll see, as you'll see, a non-solution looks pretty convincing. Yeah, the idea of rook c8 is lining up this rook with the queen is very convenient. But anyway, so knight g5. I don't know if Aronian was familiar with this line or not. He was obviously familiar with this position, I'm sure, but c5, I don't know if he was familiar with yet. So this is a nice move. The idea is you might sacrifice a pawn, but you'll get a lot of compensation in return. So knight h7, taking the pawn. And now Anand plays a beautiful move here, knight g4. So it may look like he's giving up the rook, but the rook is completely immune. So after, say, knight f8, how would black win here? I'm sure there's a couple ways, actually. Yeah, actually, I'm sure queen h4 is one way. Another more forcing way might just be this.
Yeah, that's
Nice.
sick.
And then, moving the bishop with discovered check looks hard to stop. So taking the rook is hardly an option for white. So unleashing this bishop is pretty scary. Now, Anand does mention that the best move for white here is probably h3. And then after, say, bishop h2, you play queen h4. And it does look pretty scary for white, but it's not all lost. I mean, you could play maybe d5 to block off white's bishop. You could also play bishop b4, I believe. So there are some options. White's not lost. So this was probably the best route at this point. But instead, Aronian played f4. And now it was here that Anand mentions that he was partially inspired by, I don't know if you've seen Rubinstein's Brilliancy. It's played in 1907. I forget the opponent. But it's a very famous Rubinstein game. It features kind of the same positioning of the bishops on b7 and d6. So it's pretty cool. To me, that just goes to show the usefulness of knowing chess games and different openings, so that you get familiar with these kind of patterns here. So it was because of Anand's association of the pawn structure and pieces similar to that game that he found this idea for black. So take on d4, and now black to play. We'll see if you can play like Anand here. He's played some excellent opening moves so far, but here is where he thought for about half an hour and had to get out of his prep. So do you notice anything that f4 weakened? So what did f4 weaken? We're all told that we should be careful about moving our f-pawns, right? So which diagonals does playing f4 weaken? Weakens a couple. Well, specifically, which ones? Yeah, so in the opening, we're usually worried about a queen check on h4. So the h4, e1 diagonal for white. And the other diagonal it weakens is also important, the a7, g1 diagonal. And here, we're not worried about h4, e1, but we are worried about a7, g1. So how can black try to take advantage of that? So you want to get a bishop or a queen there, ideally, right? It may not be immediately obvious how, though. Unfortunately, a move like queen b6 might come to mind, but it's too slow. White can take the rook, and unfortunately, there's nothing really going on there. So you don't have time to kind of diddle-dally around. So he played bishop c5. This is just beautiful. I mean, as much as I'd like to think I could come up with this, I would probably never see this in game. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. So the idea, first of all, is that if white doesn't take your bishop, you're just going to take b4. So white pretty much has no choice, but if white were to take your bishop, then after knight takes c5, we would have a beautiful position because bishop's under attack, But unfortunately, there's no real time to defend the bishop because queen d4 is threatened. You know, for example, bishop e2. Oh, how would black win here?
What about just queen d4?
Yeah. Queen d4, white has no choice. Now knight f2.
Yeah.
You gotta take because otherwise we get mated, right? But if we take the knight, then after queen f2, we're threatened with mate on g2, and there's no good way to defend it because, you know, if you play bishop f3, it's mate. If you play bishop f1, it's mate. If you play bishop d3, it's mate. I don't even know of a way you could even sack it. I was thinking maybe you could sack the queen, I guess, for mate. You can maybe play, yeah. I don't think white has anything. Maybe knight f6 and queen h7 or something. I don't know. Yeah, so unfortunately, white would be in big trouble there. Now, Anand does mention, I think, that it was probably his best continuation, and then to play queen e2. I think, actually, maybe it was knight takes f8. Maybe this was his suggestion. And then queen d4, and knight takes d3. Then h3. Knight f2. And then after knight d3, black has his dominant position. The white knight is trapped on f8, you might notice.
It's just a better move because there's no mate.
Yeah. As you'll see in the game, Aronian gets crushed. Although it's not immediately obvious. So he played bishop e2. So he's trying to get rid of this knight on g4, which is causing us so many problems with knight f2, right? So it's logical. Now, the most obvious move for black here is just take the pawn, right? But after king h1, it's actually not that clear what you'll do next. Because this knight is a key component to your attack, and if you lose it, well, it's going to be kind of hard. So what do you think Anand did instead?
Knight takes h2 again.
Yeah, knight h2 is a good conception, because if we take, we get mated. But unfortunately, as there's a theme similar in the game, white could take on f8 with this idea of queen h7. So queen h4 would be beautiful, except for white can trade queens. So this is a theme that we're going to see later. But yeah, that's a good idea. So he played this beautiful move, which, interestingly enough, in the interview, he just glosses over it like it's obvious. It's kind of kind of amazed. He played knight e5. So instead of actually, attacking or taking something, he just puts another piece on pre. Of course, his idea is to try to get to d4 with the queen, with that knight f2, queen f2 idea, right? So that's the kind of power of the queen there. So unfortunately, white doesn't have much choice. Got to get rid of one of those pesky knights. But now bishop d4, knight g4. And here is apparently a point. This is the only point in the game where Anand says, "I'm proud of this move." Anand played a beautiful move. Now, you have to understand what he was thinking about. So he rejected the move queen h4. Now, why did he reject this move?
Queen exchange.
Exactly, queen h7. This is the problem. Because after queen h7, knight h7, king h7, black does have a compensation, but it's hard to say that he's even going to be okay here. So what you want to do is stop this queen h7 idea. So how can we stop this? So if you play g6, white will just play knight takes g6. And that guards h4, and if you take the knight, then the white queen comes in. So how else can we stop queen h7? What's that? Yeah, that's exactly what he did. So chess logic. So queen h7 is threatened, so let's block it. Yeah. Now knight g6. Of course, knight e6 doesn't do anything because queen h4 we get mated. Right, h3, queen h3, right. So knight g6. And now another strong move, queen f6. So black threatens the knight. Now Unfortunately, white can't get rid of these attackers because h3 runs into queen g6, and the knight is taboo because of the mate. And also knight e5 isn't good either. How can black win against knight e5? Queen h4 as usual isn't that good because white takes the knight. Yeah, knight h2. If you take, we get mated. And otherwise, black is still threatening to come in at h4 and take an f1. White can't meet the threats here. So Aronian picked h3, but this is also not good. Queen g6, queen e2, queen h5, threatening queen h3 mate, queen d3. And now, how do you finish the job? Here's a couple moves.
Bishop.
Yeah, that's actually what he chose. He chose bishop e3. So the idea is you want to threaten queen h3 mate. Takes on g2 or h2, right? Yeah. Knight e3 is also winning. Yeah. So bishop e3 ends. So in 23 moves, he absolutely crushes Aronian. I mean, that's pretty amazing. You don't see 2800s lose in 23 moves very often. So this game is certainly impressive. And I think this game won the Game of the Year award for that year. So, made a lot of impressions on a lot of people too. Any questions on this? Yeah, I would definitely take a look at that So versus Sevion game too. It's very interesting. One thing I'll take note of is the line with bishop takes h7. In this line, so if you look at this with a computer, it'll initially rate this position as excellent for white. Depending which one you use, I guess +1, +2. But the computer really doesn't understand the scope of black's compensation, I guess. Maybe if I analyze it with a better computer, better processor, it might think differently. But at least Stockfish on my i7, which is a pretty good processor, takes a while to understand that white is not doing that great. Yeah, part of the problem for white, so if you take note, so white has pawns for the piece, right? So, how many pawns do we have? 3 pawns, right? Or is it 4 pawns? Let's see. I guess it's 4, actually, sorry.
So, it looks like white is overextended again.
Well, not quite.
Not really?
So, in generally speaking, like having pawns for a piece, it's better in an endgame kind of situation, or when you can push the pawns. But in the middle game, they're not as valuable because it's hard to make queens when your king is surrounded by a bunch of pieces. So the problem white has in this position is that he can't make use of the pawns so much. He can only really use them to try to restrict black's pieces. So black also has open lines on the king side, and if you check out that Sevion So game, that's pretty much what Sevion used. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to defend against all the black pieces. So that's still a place where computers aren't perfect. I mean, this is only one instance. I mean, the vast majority of cases, computers understand chess much better than people. But there are these cases where they don't seem to really understand. All right.
So you may recall that the FIDE and PCA championships were reunited. Kramnik had won the PCA championship from Kasparov. Kramnik, who was a little less or a little more amenable to FIDE than Kasparov certainly was, agreed to play in a world championship match against Topalov in 2006. He won that match and thereby reunited the championships and effectively ended the PCA. The PCA essentially ceased to exist. Kasparov had retired from professional chess at that point. So there were no more backers, and so now we've just had FIDE from, I guess the PCA existed from 1992 to 2006, and since then the chess world has been reunited. So in 2007, FIDE decided, in its infinite wisdom, that instead of having a knockout tournament or instead of having a candidate cycle and a challenger and a world championships challenge Kramnik, blah, 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 that they were just going to do a round-robin tournament. So they did a round-robin tournament in Mexico City in 2007, and Anand won that tournament. You'll note that he drew, double round robin, I should say. He drew against Kramnik in both of their games, but picked up enough points elsewhere that he became world champion. Now, under the terms of the somewhat shaky reunification of the professional organizations, Kramnik had the right to a return match. So he had an automatic seed into a rematch against Anand the following year. So in 2008, they played again, this time in a formal match, and Anand won fairly handily. Incidentally, Anand said, he didn't think it was right that Kramnik got an automatic seed into a challenge match, but they remain on friendly terms. In fact, to this day, Kramnik asks Anand for pictures of his kid, for him to text him pictures of his kid and stuff. So they're still, and Kramnik has helped him prepare for championship matches and such. So they're on friendly terms. They're still buddies. 2008, and at this time, Anand's been at the top of the chess world. Well, he participated in his first candidates match in 1991. He competed in his first World Championship match, PCA World Championship match in 1995. And here we are 13 years later, and he's world champion, and he's been world champion for several years at this point. And it's at this point that Kasparov says, he's had a good run, but I don't think he can go on any longer. This will not be the only time that Kasparov will be proved wrong, but it's certainly notable because Anand in 2010 retained his title against Topalov. Now, you may know that this tournament was played in Bulgaria, Topalov's home turf, and that Anand retained his title. But what you may not know is the interesting story of the hurdles that Anand had to go through to even compete in this tournament. Does anybody recall in 2010 there was that big volcanic eruption in Iceland and all the planes were grounded because of it? Well, that actually happened right when Anand was supposed to fly to Bulgaria to play Topalov for the World Championship. So all the planes were grounded. There were no flights into or out of Europe. And Anand contacts the tournament organizers and says, I can't get there. Can we delay the tournament by 3 days so that I have enough time to travel there by alternate means? And they say, no. Now, the tournament organizers are in Bulgaria. Topalov is Bulgarian. Maybe there was some favoritism shown there, but the point is that Anand is a nice guy, and sometimes that subjects him to situations like if Kasparov had said, I need 3 days, and the organizer said no, I think Kasparov would say, no, I'm Kasparov, you're going to give me 3 days. Anand didn't press it. Instead, he and his wife hopped in the car, and they drove 40 hours from India to Bulgaria. Now, the tournament, the match did have to start 1 day late because it took that long to drive there. I mean, you can imagine India to Bulgaria, that's quite a trek. Even getting out of India probably took a whole day from where he lives in India. And so this match was played in Bulgaria with a very tired Anand dropping the first game, but quickly recovering his form and edging out Topalov to retain the title. So this is in 2010. He comes home to great acclaim. He's named Indian of the Year. He is invited to a state dinner with Prime Minister Singh, with President Obama. He's the only sports figure invited to that dinner, so quite a prestigious honor. As you can imagine, Anand is highly viewed in India, has received pretty much every award there is. And he's very well respected, and he's single-handedly pretty much created a chess boom. Chennai is now the center of chess in India, and Anand is its figurehead. And yet he's still a very, quiet guy, likes staying at home, playing cards with his family, and, his wife's cooking and enjoys eating. They say portions the size of baby elephants. He's not political. He doesn't mix into that realm. He's not outspoken with regard to FIDE like Kasparov has been. He's not put his name forward. To my knowledge, he's not even endorsed a candidate for FIDE elections. He just kind of tries to get along with everybody and not rock the boat. Interesting case of nice guy finishing first. So in 2012, he defends his title for the last time to date against Gelfand. Gelfand, I think at this point, Anand is like 43, Gelfand is like 42. It's very interesting that you have people who've played against each other in the 90s who are still playing against each other in the World Championship. Anand retains his title. As you probably recall, in 2013, he lost to Anand-Carlsen pretty handily. In fact, he didn't win a game in the World Championship. And that was held in Chennai, in Anand's backyard. Not literally his backyard, but across town. He was able to stay at home. And that was a very difficult loss for him. You have a quote there from him. And incidentally, I should point out that Anand-Carlsen had helped prepare him for the Topalov match. So had Wojciech, so had Garry Kasparov, so had Kazimdanov, and Kramnik as well. So a lot of very well-known chess figures had helped Anand prepare for various World Championship matches, including Anand-Carlsen. And Carlsen then, perhaps using that experience and just using his skill and using his play style, was able to turn, minute advantages into grinding him out into wins. So that was pretty remarkable. Anand bounces back, wins the candidate cycle in 2014, faces Carlsen again, this time in Sochi. That match was handily won by Carlsen, but a little bit closer. Anand won a game in Game 3, and for a while it looked like the match could go either way. And now we get into the current candidate cycle. And, you may wonder, well, he's getting a little older, so that could really affect him. But more importantly, he now has a family. So his son, as I've mentioned, his son's name Akhil, or Anand Akhil, was born April 9th, 2011. Incidentally, his son is 4 days older than my son, so we have that in common. And here you see a picture of young Akhil doing what most children do, and that's stealing daddy's wallet. And, he's been busy being a father, and he talks about how hard it is to be away from home and miss certain milestones, like his child's first laugh, for example. And so perhaps the birth of his child in 2011, perhaps that detracted from his chess preparation. I mean, he'd be only human if that were the case. But again, this is Anand reinventing himself. Anand arguably is having one of his best years ever in 2015. He's had a couple of second-place finishes, including in Norway in the month of May when he defeated Anand-Carlsen in their game. He has broken the 2,800 barrier in ELO for the first time in his career. He's currently rated number 2 or number 3 in the world. So despite his automatic seeding into the candidate cycle, he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do in 1995, which is reinvent himself to make sure that he stays relevant and keeps producing quality wins and keeps competing. He's done this again and again and again. And when Warren says that he is a favorite to win the candidate cycle, he's my favorite as well. He's my favorite to face Carlsen. Will he fare better against Carlsen, or would he fare better against Carlsen if they were played again? I don't know. But what I do know is that Anand has continued to make progress, and he's continued to make great strides in his opening preparation, and it's continuing to pay great dividends. And as a case in point, we'll look at our final game of the evening. This is a game from that aforementioned tournament in Norway in May 2015, when Anand took a game off of Carlsen in what I consider, and maybe Warren will agree, in pretty convincing fashion. So again, for our last game of the night, I'll turn that back over to Warren.
Yeah, and you might take note, too, in their match in 2013, Carlsen pretty much crushed Anand. I mean, the final score was, 6.5, 3.5. Anand didn't win a single game. In the last match, Anand actually fared better. He took a game off Carlsen and only lost 6.5 to 4.5. And and this year, of course, he won in this is an individual encounter. So the trend is, strangely enough, Anand's getting older, and the trend is getting better for him. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. So let's take a look at this game. It was very recent at Norway Chess. Now, yes, Carlsen did have a hard time, but all that being said, I forget what round this was in. Round 4? Yeah. I mean, up to that point, yes, he did lose to Topalov in one game, but in that game, he lost on time. Carlsen did in a winning position. And then he also lost to Caruana, but that's hardly shameful. So I wouldn't exactly say Carlsen was, depressed or tilting or whatever you want to call it. So let's take a look. You have a question?
Yeah.
So we have a Rui Lopez. Of course, Anand and Carlsen
And not a Berlin defense.
Yeah, and not a Berlin. Yeah.
Yay.
Although Carlsen does play, as you'll see in the opening, he plays quite a bit, so it's not too surprising. And given Carlsen had just lost to Caruana in Berlin, I guess he wanted to play something different. So they both played this position many times. There's nothing new to them. Typical Rui. D3 is a little bit unusual. Usually, of course, you'll see Rook E1. That's the most popular move. But D3 has its merits too. One merit is that you avoid the martial attack, right? So, and Carlsen has been known to play that. Sort of avoids some theory. And we end up transposing to an opening that Carlsen likes to play a lot. So far, it's kind of similar to what's called the Zaitsev, where Black will play Bishop B7, Rook E8, Bishop F8. That's kind of indicative of that. But soon we'll transpose to a Briar. And the Briar is signaled by this move Knight B8, transferring the Knight to D7. The advantage of this is it gives Black C-pawn some flexibility to contest the center. So D4, Knight D7. So they reach a position that they're both pretty familiar with, and it's also encouraged in a bunch of GM games. And now Bishop G5. So there is quite a bit of choice here, but most popular move is H6. The idea is just to try to break this pin Knight immediately. And the pin is pretty annoying, and as you'll see later on, Carlsen might regret not playing H6. So I don't know if Carlsen deviated here because of preparation, or if he didn't want to show his cards, maybe. Maybe he has some preparation here with H6 or otherwise. But he played Bishop G7. Now the downside of playing this, though, is Anand's move Queen Z2. It's annoying for Black because you no longer can play H6 to break this pin. And also, just generally speaking, White controls H6 square now. So this becomes kind of a problem for Black. So Rook B8. There's probably some alternative. Knight C5 immediately is probably okay. But okay, Rook B8. Knight H2. Bishop C8. And actually here, in an interview after the game, Anand regretted not just simply taking on B5 here. And I think he's right. It just opens up the file for the rook and avoids any of the counterplay that Carlsen gets later on the B file. Anyway, Knight G4, Knight C5. I guess Anand hadn't considered Knight C5. The problem is that Black is intending to maybe take on G4 with Bishop, and also open up this B file for the rook. So it's a little bit annoying for White. So Knight H6 check. So this is kind of awkward for Black because King H8 is impossible, right? And King F8 isn't so great either. The king is rather awkwardly placed, and White could just take on B5. And later on, you can think about opening up the F file. So unfortunately, he parted ways with the bishop. But of course, this is a huge risk on Carlsen's part because you lose a defender on the king side, and now White's control over the dark squares is pretty much uncontested. So it leads to a very double-edged position. So now B takes A4. So this gives Black some counterplay in the B file. Rook A2. Now A3 is a nice move. So this move is simply to give black access to b2 or b1 or b3 with the knight, and rook a3 is of course bad because of rook b2, and ba3 leads to kind of awkward positioning. Although a3 does let white's rook get in the game, as we'll see later, kind of conveniently. But okay, ba3, knight b7. Black sets back the knight because otherwise white will just pin it again. So black needs to get out of that pin while he can. So knight b7, f4, a5, rook f1. Yeah, and f6 Anand didn't like at all. By the way, there are some tricky moves here. Now, queen h4, he of course rejected. Now, what would white do against queen h4? It looks tricky because it's a double attack, right?
Bishop g5.
Yeah, the queen doesn't have a lot of squares to go to. And now? Yep. Queen's trapped, right? So, of course, Carlsen's not going to fall for this. Anand does note that he could have tried for some counterplay, maybe along the lines of knight d3, trying to exchange off one of the bishops, maybe get queen b6 in after. So this may have been a better idea. Anand was not a fan of playing f6 in this position because it gives white kind of an easy plan. So f6, f5. So it's kind of like a King's Indian position you'll see, where black plays, f4 in that opening, gain space and restrict the white pieces. And here it's the same case. So white doesn't want to let black's knight get that e5 square in some case, and he's prepared to open up the king side with h4, h5 later too. So knight d3 takes, and now Anand played a really nice move. What do you think white should do here?
Why don't we just take?
So take on z3 is what Carlsen was hoping for. It would help him get some counterplay. So black could then follow up with queen b6 and bishop a6. And give black pretty decent counterplay. For example, king h1, bishop a6. Now black has some weaknesses to hit at.
Well, if queen b6, then you just tempo the queen by bishop e3.
Bishop e3, Bishop e3, for example, I think knight c5. Yeah, I think white wants to avoid giving this kind of counterplay. Now he found this nice move, queen d1. These backwards moves are always hard to find, but it's really nice because not only does it let white's other rook get into the game, but it prepares to bring the queen over to the king side and attack g6. So really nice move. It's always hard to find these backwards moves because when you're attacking, you just don't think of going backwards very often. It's not very natural, right? So this is really nice. So queen d1, rook e7, rook f2. And now he takes the pawn. He's not concerned about the bishop a6 idea, as you'll see. He's only concerned about attacking. So queen g4. So the exchange is just a moot point. So taking on f1 is of course bad because we simply take on g6, right? Yeah, that's not good for black. So g5. Now h4. Yeah, white's not concerned about the loss of the exchange here. The black king is too weak, so pursuing an attack is important. So bishop f1, rook takes. So black's going to lose g5, and the attack is going to continue. So queen d7. Black can't defend g5 anyway, so he's preparing to guard g7 with the queen and the rook, which is useful because of what you'll see later here. So takes, queen h5. White's trying to play f6 and bishop g7. h8, f6. So white wins back the exchange. And white also keeps a lot of activity. So knight f5. Beautiful square for the knight. Queen g6. So white just has a ton of activity. Unfortunately, black has to give it back the exchange because playing rook h6 would just be too passive. White could play rook f8, and then rook, what does he suggest? He suggests, I believe, that was rook a8, that's right. And this pawn at e4 is still immune because of knight f5, h6. You can't even play like rook h4 because it's the same idea. And white's going to get past pawn either winning a5 and or d6. So you sack back the exchange, but here white wins nicely. Rook f8, bringing this rook around to attack d6 or a5. a4 defending the pawn, but now c4. And here Carlsen just gave up because there's no way to defend d6. For example, knight e4, king e3, and black's run out of resources to defend that pawn. And with the two connected passers, the knight's not enough to stop it. So a pretty impressive rout. Carlsen really didn't have much counterplay, sure. But a pretty impressive win. Carlsen never really had any chance to win, I don't think. And the Briar is also an opening that Carlsen is very familiar with. So it's a very impressive win for Anand. All right.
So with that win in Norway Chess 2015, Anand's lifetime record against Carlsen stands at 8 wins, 10 losses, and 35 draws in classical play. I'm not counting blitz and rapid in that number. That is, when you consider the fact that he's -5 in the World Chess Championship against Carlsen, he has a winning tournament record. He just needs to convert that into a winning match record. And frankly, I don't put that beyond Anand's capabilities. So we will see in the candidate cycle how well Anand does and if he earns the right to challenge Magnus Carlsen for the World Chess Championship. For this lecture, I used a book written by Vishy Anand and John Nunn. The first edition was published, I believe, in 2000 or 2001 after he won the FIDE championship. The second edition, which was updated, took us through 2012 until right before his title defense against Gelfand. So 3 of the games we covered today were annotated. The first 3 games we covered were annotated in this book. And then the last 2 games, the postmortems, are available on YouTube. I also looked at an interview conducted by an Indian television channel where they went to Anand's home and they interviewed him and his wife and his parents and one of Anand's friends. And they followed him around a bit and watched him sign autographs and chatted with him about his thoughts about many things. And that's when it really hit home to me. This was in 2007, this idea of reinvention that is so prominent as a theme in Anand's career. And then finally, I quoted a couple of times an article written by Anand's wife that was published in January 2014, which really gave an intimate view into her perspective as a wife and into family dynamics. And frankly, I'm impressed at how stable his family life is and how much that enables him to perform as well as he does. So in the months to come, next month, we're either going to look at Caruana or Nakamura. And then in the months to come, we'll look at the other candidates as they come along. And we'll do something similar, although frankly, Anand has had a much longer career. There's been much more written about him. And so for the other parts, we will rely more on more current interviews. Caruana, at 23 years old, hasn't had a book written about him yet, to my knowledge. So we'll rely more on published statements and interviews, and perhaps, reach out to the players themselves and see if they'd be interested in answering a few questions for this. So perhaps we can get some feedback from them that way. So again, we hope to see you next month for our next part. And as always, are there any questions about information presented or just opinions about the upcoming cycle?
Carlsen?
Carlsen's 24 now?
Yes.
I think he's 24 now.
Yeah, he was born in December of 1990, I think.
Okay. So 24 and a half. Yeah, won the World Championship, I guess, at 23.
He's slightly older.
Or 22, right? Before he turned 23.
But it pisses you off.
Hey, at least the world champion isn't younger than me.
Who's the oldest chess champion?
Who was the oldest when they were champion?
Yeah, when they were champion. Who's the oldest? I'm trying to see if I can make it.
Well, I mean, Karpov was the FIDE champion until 2000, so that would have made him somewhere in his mid to late 30s. Anand was champion in his early 40s, so I can't think of any champion off the top of my head who was older than Anand.
So he would be the oldest?
Anand was 42 when he lost the championship, roughly, to Carlsen, so I would think Anand. I mean, going back there. I mean, maybe Steinitz or something way back when. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at it. But certainly in the modern era, I can't think of any champion older than Anand. Certainly competing at this level, no one can claim that distinction. I'd be interested actually to see Anand and Kasparov play now. That'd be interesting to see. I think Anand might turn the tables on him.
What's Kasparov doing now?
He runs many different educational foundations. He speaks at various events around the country, writes prolifically, both newspaper articles, particularly critical of the Putin administration, and other topics. Well, he did. He ran for president a couple of times, but in my Kasparov lecture, part 2, I explained that he's not been back to Russia in a couple of years, and he can't because, as he puts it, he's not in favor of one-way tickets. It's Kasparov's understanding that if he were to travel back to Russia, he'd be detained. So he now criticizes the regime from afar.
It's crushed.
Other questions?
Politics.